Welcome everybody to today's class. Today we are looking at Of Mice and Men, which is a story by John Steinbeck. I'd like to look at the vocabulary and the grammar in this story, and I hope I can show you that he's a great writer because he has used a lot of rhetorical devices and he's used an interesting clause structure. He's used a lot of interesting sentences, and I hope I can show that he's been using a lot of the things which I've been speaking about in previous classes when I've told you how to make your sentences more interesting, or I've explained at least several ways that you can make your sentences more interesting. And I think the best place to find interesting sentences is in books. So if we look at this, the first few paragraphs of Mice and Men, and anybody can find this story online. If you just put Of Mice and Men PDF into Google, you will find a copy. So notice that it starts with a fronted adverbial phrase, a few miles south of Soledad. Now, it started with this fronted adverbial phrase, and that's why we have a comma, and then we have a main clause. The Salinas River drops in close to the hillside bank and runs deep and green. So we've got two verb phrases now. We've got drops in close to the hillside bank, the first verb phrase, and runs deep and green, the second verb phrase. Okay, so he's used two verb phrases in the very first main clause. Another thing to notice is how many adjectives you can see. Now, I've put a lot of the adjectives in grey, although some of them are nouns. This one is a noun, the dark. But there was a further adjective, dark of face. And I've highlighted these adjectives. They're in grey, but I've highlighted them because there is a lot of repetition with the adjectives. You see deep, deep, deep with these adjectives. So it runs deep. Further down we have deep and so crisp, and then further down again we have deep pool. Now this repetition is not coincidental. He's done this on purpose, and repetition is one of the main rhetorical devices, really. It gives the text a poetic feel, the repetition of the similar adjectives. It's not just deep, 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 which is repeated. You also have green, green, green. So it runs deep and green. And then we have green with every spring. And of course, green is a colour we associate with spring. And then later on, we have green pool. So there's a lot of repetition on this page, and it helps to give the text that kind of echoing feel where you have the words echoed over and over again. So we also get limbs, limb, limb, horizontal limb, the limb is worn, and mottled white recumbent limbs. And notice that when he uses adjectives, he uses them in a lot of different ways. Sometimes he says adjective and adjective, adjective and adjective. So he says deep and green, he says strong and rocky, he says fresh and green, he says deep and so crisp, small and quick, thin and bony. But sometimes he uses asyndetic coordination, which just means no conjunctions. That's all it means, so no and. He talks about mottled, white, recumbent limbs, and that's three adjectives used together. They're coordinate adjectives, so he's got a comma in between each one, and we call this asyndetic coordination when there's no and. So that's another way that he's using adjectives. Okay, now another thing to notice is the repetition here of on one side of the river, on the valley side, on the sandy bank, on the sand, on the sandbanks. So there's a lot of repetition there with the prepositional phrase on one side of the river, on the valley side, on the sandy bank, on the sandbank. That's a lot of repetition as well. And of course, I'm sure he's doing this for a reason. Now, in the next paragraph, we also get a very nice sentence here where he starts with, the damp flats are covered with the night tracks of coons, and with the spread pads of dogs from the ranches, and with the split wedge tracks of deer that come to drink in the dark. So notice the damp flats are covered with blah blah blah, and with blah blah blah, and with blah blah blah. And notice the repetition of tracks, the night tracks, the split wedge tracks. So again, It's this kind of thing, it's this kind of repetition that gives the text a poetic feel. Okay, so we've got those prepositional phrases repeated, and we've got on the next part we've also got a path beaten hard by boys coming down from the ranches to swim in the deep pool, and beaten hard by tramps who come warily down from the highway in the evening to jungle up near water. So again, notice the repetition: a path, beaten hard by, down from the ranches, down from the highway. That's a lot of repetition, and it is all done on purpose, of course. So the main reason why there are a lot of adjectives in these first few paragraphs is that it starts by setting the scene. Clearly he's setting the scene of where the action is going to take place. And by the third and fourth paragraphs, or certainly by the fourth paragraph, but he introduces them in the third paragraph, we get the two men emerging. And these are the two protagonists, the two main characters from Of Mice and Men. And he starts by showing you what is similar about these two men. He says, both were dressed in denim trousers and in denim coats with brass buttons. Both wore black, shapeless hats, and both carried tight blanket rolls. Notice the repetition of both. Yeah, 3 times he says it. Both were dressed in denim trousers and in denim coats. Notice the in denim and in denim. Yeah, it's a repetition of the prepositional phrase in denim, in denim. And clearly he wants you to focus on these two together when he's saying both. So he's showing you what's similar concerning the two men. But once he's told you that they both were dressed in denim trousers and in denim coats, both wore black shapeless hats, and both carried tight blanket rolls, once he's showed you how they are similar, you realise that they're really only similar in the way they dress and in what they carry. He doesn't say that they're similar in any other way. And once he's told you how they're similar, he goes on to tell you how they're different. Notice he says the first man was small and quick, dark of face, with restless eyes and sharp, strong features. Every part of him was defined. Small, strong hands, slender arms, a thin and bony nose. Even here, notice no and here, small, strong hands, but we've got an and here, thin and bony nose. So he's using lots of different structures, lots of different phrases, and this is why the writing is interesting. And then he goes on to say behind him walked his opposite, a huge man, not a small man, shapeless of face, so not well defined, with large pale eyes and wide sloping shoulders. So here he's contrasting the two men. Clearly the second man is very different in appearance from the first man. And notice here as well, there's a lot of repetition with the word less. Noiselessly, lifeless, shapeless, restless, shapeless. So they're the 5 words that end in less that we get towards the end. It's all from here in this last part of the first 4 paragraphs. Okay, so there's a lot of less going on there. Noiseless, lifeless, shapeless, restless. Okay, and I wanted to talk a little bit about the inversion and fronting, because there is some inversion and fronting going on here. Firstly, we get the fronted adverbial that I've already mentioned, a few miles south of Soledad. Then we get on one side of the river, on the valley side, on the sandy bank, on the sandbanks, and also in front of a low horizontal limb of a giant sycamore. There's another fronted adverbial phrase. And we do get one fronted adverbial plus inversion. We get, and then from the direction of the state highway came the sound of footsteps on crisp sycamore leaves. Now, of course, the subject of came comes at the end here. The sound of footsteps on crisp sycamore leaves came from the direction of the state highway. So really, we're inverting the subject and the verb, and we're fronting the adverbial. So it's another interesting sentence, and this is why John Steinbeck is still well remembered and still well read, because he has a good way of making interesting sentences. He doesn't make each sentence sound similar to the last. And so do try to do what John Steinbeck has been doing and what other great writers do. Do vary your clause structure. Do use a lot of different phrases, a lot of different approaches to making sentences, and do think about the repetition, because good stories have a lot of repetition. It adds that poetic element. Okay, thanks for watching this lesson. I hope you've enjoyed it. Please subscribe and give me a like if you've enjoyed this class, and I hope to see you all soon.